All right, good evening, everybody. I think we're going to start. Welcome to this very special event organized by the Observatorio Cervantes at Harvard University, together with Widener Library and Houghton Library, to commemorate the centenary, as everybody knows, the centenary of Pérez Galdós' death, which took place in January, precisely in January 1920. I would like to start by expressing my sincere gratitude to the people responsible at Widener Library for making this event possible, allowing us to hold this activity in their premises. And I would also like to thank Christine Jacobson, Assistant Curator for Modern Books and Manuscripts from Houghton Library, who are the real holders, as you know, of the original manuscript of Fortunata y Jacinta, for giving us the chance of seeing it. The viewing of this text will certainly make this event a highlight in the series of activities which are being organized in 2020 to commemorate Galdós' death. I am particularly grateful to Lynn Shirey, the librarian responsible for Spain, Portugal, and Latin America at Widener Library, for her enthusiastic and efficient collaboration ever since I suggested the idea for this event to her. And a really warm thank you goes to Professor Luis Fernández Cifuentes for having accepted my invitation from the very beginning to give a talk as the main part of this tribute to Galdós, and thus sharing his expertise and his vast knowledge of the writer and of his period. So we're very pleased to start off our academic program for 2020 with this very special activity. And let us now have Lynn Shirey have the floor to introduce the manuscript to us. Thank you.
So,
No, you don't have to do anything.
oh, okay.
No.
So this manuscript came to Houghton Library in 1966 from with the help of our dear departed Stephen Gilman, who, professor here, was an expert in Galdós. We have a copy of his books here, one of his books here, over here.
This one.
The Art of the Novel, Galdós and the Art of the European Novel. He apparently, while in Spain, became connected with Doña Maria, who is the daughter of Galdós, and purchased it from her. We're not sure if we purchased it, he purchased it. There's a little bit of mystery around the story, but that's where we got it, and that's what's in the record. So it's been here since 1966, and some people might know more here. This manuscript is in 8 boxes, just like this. What we have right here are the first and last of the 8 boxes. If anyone's interested in looking at the very beginning or the very end to see if there are differences or if there's anything interesting to be found. We also have a first edition of the printed book from Houghton Library as well, and you can compare the first page of the manuscript with the first page in the book, which, from what I've seen, looks to be exactly the same. I'm not sure if there are other editions. Were other editions done in between or not? This manuscript is famous because the Casa Museo Pérez Galdós in Gran Canaria has wanted this for years. They have 35 manuscripts of their own. They also have microfilm of other manuscripts at the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid. And we eventually microfilmed this manuscript and gave them a copy. These days, nobody wants microfilm, and we're hoping to digitize this, hopefully this year, in honor of the centenary, and make it available for everyone on the web. Please feel free to take another look at it. Christine needs to take it back to the vault shortly, and we've got the first edition of the novel, the manuscript, the Stephen Gilman book, and Luis here has some other first editions of other novels by Galdós as well, which he will be talking about.
Right.
So if you haven't had a chance and you want to come up and take a look, please do so now.
Yeah, we'll have a little while for you to have a look at the edition before we
can
start with the lecture.
I think a lot of people are seated, but you can as long as we keep them in some kind of order or put them back in the same order.
I said some of this earlier, so I'm sorry to those who have already heard this. You're welcome to look at the manuscript. If you don't mind, I'll just demonstrate how you should do this. So keep it flat on the table. Move from right to left, keeping it flat on the table. Try to avoid bending the pages. And when you're done with the folder, please just put it back in the sort of order and manner that you found it in. I know that the probably logistics of the room make it difficult for everybody to come to the manuscript. It's okay with me if we pass out a few of the folders so that everybody can see it. I just would encourage you to help me keep it in order so I can put it back. I won't get in trouble with my boss. With the book, if you could just keep it in its cradle, so we might, if we do move it, I'm happy to bring it to you, we just need to keep it in a cradle. Can I bring a folder to everybody?
Yeah.
Can we have some folder?
Should we have one here?
Please, sure.
Pardon me.
Qué buena.
If you allow me, while you're perusing the manuscript, I'm just going to read briefly a few lines that Jose Maria Merino, a writer who was with us at the Observatorio last November, and who was preparing a last edition of Fortunata y Jacinta, which has just come out, and who came to see the manuscript thanks to Lynn Sherry and got really moved by this possibility, wrote these lines in the prologue, which has just come out, the prologue to this very last edition of Fortunata y Jacinta, and he mentions that moment when he was allowed to view the manuscript. So I'll just read while people are looking at it, what he says in Spanish. Mientras preparaba este prólogo, tuve que hacer un viaje a la Universidad de Harvard para un encuentro literario con mi hija Ana, que coordinó el profesor don José Manuel del Pino, que está aquí presente con nosotros, viewing the manuscript intently, en el Observatorio del Instituto Cervantes, dirigido por doña Marta Mateo. En una visita a los abundantes y actualizadísimos fondos hispanos de la biblioteca Widener, nos informó la bibliotecaria para Latinoamérica, España y Portugal, doña Lynn Sherry, de que ellos, en la Houghton Library, conservaban el manuscrito original de Fortunata y Jacinta, adquirido en 1966 a la hija de don Benito, María Pérez Galdós. Cuenta Mercedes López Baral que a través de Stephen Gellman, como ha dicho Lynn, y se ofreció a mostrárnoslo, lo que hizo a la mañana siguiente. Quien lea este prólogo puede imaginarse mi entusiasmada sorpresa. No voy a hablar de versiones porque es tema propio de los especialistas, pero sí recordar este manuscrito original que está conservado en 8 cajas como la que muestro en las fotografías. Reproduzco a continuación la fotografía de la primera página en la que falta el subtítulo definitivo, 2 historias de casadas, pero donde se puede comprobar que el arranque responde al texto que se considera canónico. Reproduzco también la última página y se podrá comprobar que en ella don Benito suprimió con tachaduras un largo párrafo, sin duda para no enmarañar la serenidad en el pensamiento del pobre Rubín. Debo decir que nos llamaron la atención las numerosas páginas corregidas e incluso tachadas por el autor, de las que reproduzco 3 a continuación para que se vea lo meticuloso que era Galdós en su trabajo. Y ya termino. El caso es que, para mi placer, al extraordinario viaje en el tiempo que me ha concedido la relectura de Fortunata y Jacinta, se unió una de esas casualidades de la realidad que, como me gusta decir a mí, no necesita ser verosímil. Y ello me permitió contemplar y acariciar el texto original de esta obra extraordinaria, maestra indiscutible del género novelesco, una novela imprescindible, que es como ha titulado el prólogo de esta última edición, ya os digo, que acaba de salir, una novela imprescindible. Ya está, eso era.
Ok, ¿empezamos?
Ya.
Ok.
Shall we start? Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me now introduce Luis
you're going to
Fernández
introduce me.
Cifuentes.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry. I know Luis needs no introduction here.
Yeah, right.
But I think I'll say a few words for the sake of those people who will be watching this talk in our YouTube channel. Luis is Robert and Isle Friend Professor Emeritus of Spanish at Harvard University. He taught at Princeton and at Harvard Universities for over 40 years. He's published books on Lorca, for example, on Lorca's theatre, like La Norma y la Diferencia or Cartografía del Desasosiego, and on 20th century narrative, like Teoría y Mercado de la Novela, as well as critical editions of Zorrilla, Palacio Valdés, Max Aub. And he's also edited several books of collective articles, including Spain Beyond Spain and Estudios sobre la Poesía de Lorca, and has published more than 80 articles on various subjects, from autobiography to travel literature. And he's currently working on a cultural history of the year 1955 in Spain. So it's a real honor, as you can imagine, for us to have Luis here today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Marta. Okay, I'm going to be standing and moving around because, like, my students know this is my style. So, and thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Marta. This is wonderful, especially because I have many friends here, former students, friends, dear colleagues. Thank you all for being here tonight. So, I think the first, the origin of this approach that I'm going to use tonight is probably in a statement by the great Erich Auerbach in his formidable My Mises. He claims there that 19th century fiction, so those fictions we usually label or group under the labels of realism and naturalism, cannot be fully understood without sufficient command of the, and these are his words, economic circumstances that decisively mold their plots and their characters. Now, the historical grounds for this phenomenon in the history of the novel are twofold. On the one hand, the Industrial Revolution brought unprecedented economic growth all over Europe, all over the Western world, actually, including Spain. Some people think that Spain didn't grow until the 20th century. It's not true. It grew at the same pace and even, sometimes even faster than the other European countries, at least. On the other hand, this empirical growth was accompanied by an equally unprecedented development of economic theories that tried to pin down the laws governing such growth. As a result, the so-called rise of the novel, and those few of you who are of my generation will remember the title of Ian Watt's famous book, the so-called rise of the novel and the emergence of modern economic analysis not only occurred at the same time, but it is during that period that realist novels take in distinctive economic activities of contemporary societies and give them pivotal roles in their plots. Moreover, some critics, like Jean-Joseph Gueux, claim that presence or absence of money in the novels separates deceptive fiction, an operation without reference to any stores of gold, from truthful realism based on the solid support of gold existing in person. However, so they grew together, economic theory and realist novel. However, this historical coupling of fiction and economic theory was hardly a simple correlation. 19th century economy-conscious realism actually thrived in great part against the rational and tidy grain of a political economy that in turn had realism in its blind spot. So the novelists were conscious of the economists ignored the realist novel. And I'll go back to this in a moment. Here are the basic traits of this very productive discord. 19th century political economy was much more concerned with modern free markets than it was with consumers and consumption. Within markets, it was more concerned with the self-regulating mechanics of supply and demand than it was with types of commodities. At the same time, sociologists and novelists became especially interested in the economists' neglected areas. They observed two divorced city markets. On the one hand, the financiers, banks, and stock exchange, where money, mostly invisible, was the commodity. On the other hand, the consumers' market, where money, visible, tangible, and even audible, you may remember so many references to the coins tingling or jingling in the pockets of the wealthy people. They are all over the realist novel. So money, visible, tangible, even audible, was but the means of exchange for two types of commodities: necessities and luxuries. This I'm summarizing here a number of people, especially Arjuna Padurai. And this is going to be one of the functional, or maybe I should say dysfunctional, dichotomies of my argumentation. The necessities versus the luxuries. The novelists realized from the start that or the novelists and the sociologists, that necessities, bare necessities, if I may quote Walt Disney's The Jungle Book, were of very little interest to capitalism. And here goes Padurai again, the principal cause of the expansion of trade, industry, and financed capital was the demand for luxury goods. Up until the Industrial Revolution, sumptuary laws and the church's predicates tried to control, and when I say church, I mean the church in general, not the Catholic Church necessarily. The Protestants were just as critical, if not more. The church's predicate tried to control the inordinate and sinful consumption of luxury goods, as well as its corollary, which was, of course, money lending in generally abusive interest. I'm sorry, I'm giving you my back. It's kind of, let me move a little bit here. So, the onslaught of capitalism, which the great Werner Sombart calls the child of luxury, the onslaught of capitalism dismantled those legal and ethical frames and facilitated the onset of luxury fever. The word fever is going to reappear throughout my talk. With the understanding of luxury in terms of capitalist economic prosperity rather than political morality. So, luxury will be one of the main objects, perhaps sometimes at least, or often I should say, the main object of the novelist's maneuvering through his or her plots. The realist novelist, that is. If there remain, and it did remain, if there remain a substratum of moral disapproval of luxury under capitalism, it will appear in the realist novel mostly under the guise of clinical diagnosis. So, luxury fever, as the name indicates, is not a sin, is no longer a sin, but an illness. Like so many other things that Foucault, for example, studies in his history of sexuality. Everything is an illness. Sin is no longer a category that works, that functions in that society. Now, in their study of markets, sociologists and especially novelists found fault primarily with the economist theory of consumption and consumer. And in the words of Ben Fine, economics does not effectively have a distinct theory of consumption. It just makes do with the one-size-fits-all idea of a paradigmatic consumer driven only by utility maximization. What's that mean? That means that for political economy, consumption is predominantly determined by maximization of utility subject to the prevailing budget and price constraints of rational consumers. For example, regarding luxury goods, the norm is for those to have them only if they are wealthy and of a particular socioeconomic class. Economists then ignore not only gender and other cultural factors conditioning consumers, but such prevalent irrational phenomena as conspicuous consumption and similar forms of addiction. Moreover, in economic theories, individual acts of obtaining and enjoying individual purchases become irrelevant. I am quoting here mostly Ben Fine. Realist novelists fill that gap with case after case of an epidemic of luxury fever. Distinctive consumers generally, not always, but I'll go back to this problem of gender later. Distinctive consumers, generally female and of insufficient means, who, motivated not by rational utility, but by limitless desires for superfluous luxuries, end up in ever spiraling debts when they embark in the neurotic acquisition of very specific luxury objects. So, to summarize everything I've said so far, I'm going to quote my admired colleague Louis Menand in one of her book reviews in The New Yorker. He writes, he's back from 2018, he writes, "But how was that model of the rational economic actor ever plausible? It is not just that human beings are neurotic. It is that on the list of things human beings are neurotic about, money is close to the top. Don't economists ever read novels? Practically," this is Louis Menand, of course, "practically every realist novel, from Austen and Balzac to James and Wharton, and we could say to Pérez Galdós and Pardo Bazán, for example, is about people behaving badly around money. Free markets didn't change that. They arguably made people even crazier," unquote. So, one more category before I go into the novels themselves. Morson and Shapiro, this is a recent book. One is an economist and the other one a literary scholar from Chicago. Morson and Shapiro demonstrate through Sense and Sensibility, is their book, the title of their book, that political economy, I'm not quoting, I'm summarizing, so if you read the book and find something else, let me know. That political economy deals with all things measurable through master equations. And by equations, this could be, discussed, obviously, but by equations I'm going to mean here something fixed, something given, numbers once and for all. While realist novels, interested mostly in consumers and measurable whims, require intricate plots to expose them. So this is the second dichotomy, the plots versus the equations, or the equations versus the plots. So as I turn now to realist naturalist novels themselves and try and flesh out and nuance this oversimplified summary that I just gave you, I will be reading primarily for the plot. I hope it's not a spoiler, but it's part of the analysis. It is actually essential for the analysis. So I will be reading primarily for the plot and the ways plots and their agents quarrel with economic provisions. First, I will analyze the plot in 4 novels of the financier. And I will treat those 4 novels as one. They are the so-called novelas de Torquemada by Galdós, 1889-1895. And here, as in just about every other case, we do have in Widener the first edition. Only we don't even have to go to Houghton to see them. They are in the stands here in Widener. Then I'll move to one novel of the consumer and of consumerism, one novel concerned with the dislocations produced by luxury markets. And it is Galdós's La Desheredada. This is the first edition as well. Beautiful edition, much better than the others in the sense that this paper is less acidic and the book, is really in great shape right now. Finally, I will close with a singular novel of almost pure necessity, Galdós's Misericordia, published in 1897. So, published at a time when the crisis of representability, which Jean-Joseph Gou defines as a crisis of linguistic currency, when the realist referent and the mechanisms of representation had broken down. So a time when the crisis of representability was making headway, and of the overpowering success of capitalist markets was invalidating dichotomies like luxury versus necessity. I'm saying this because if your mind is in the current markets, there is very difficult to separate luxuries and necessities. Actually, you look closely, everything, just about everything is a luxury. This started to happen at the turn of the century. I'm going to be dealing with a time when luxuries and necessities were strictly separated, and the borders were beginning to vanish, or became more and more porous. So I'm going to start by this is what I just dealt with. Sorry, I'm going to start with the financiers' novels. Now, as you may remember from your own readings of realism, the figure of the male financier and or money lender is one of realism's stock characters, and makes brief but generally very decisive appearances in many a prototypical realist plot, from Clarin's Doña Berta to Pardo Bazán, for example, Los Pazos de Ulloa. This character takes center stage in Galdós's Madrid in a series of 4 novels that grapple with el mal de la época, la fiebre de los negocios. Everything I say in Spanish is directly from the novel by Galdós that I'm dealing with at that point. So this is from Torquemada. The plots of the Torquemada novels are focused to a considerable extent on the growth of capital through the circulation of money, with a special attention to the character that governs that circulation, as well as those characters who, which is the rest of them, who mostly suffer or perish in the process. Money here no longer means el materialismo del dinero. In other words, not the accumulation of visible and tangible cash, in which only antiquated fetish worshippers of metal money found satisfaction. And these words are from Marx, none other than Karl Marx. You can think of, for example, Balzac's Gobseck as the most paradigmatic figure of this kind. Here, most of the money is forever invested and reinvested. That is, neither visible nor tangible, except indirectly in the words and especially the numbers endlessly discussed in pervasive mail conversations or registered in account books. So much like Paris, Chicago, or Barcelona, Madrid society appears envilecida por los negocios y el positivismo. Torquemada suffers from the same business fever as other famous financiers of the realist novel. For example, Gilles in Narcisse Huguet, La Febre d'Or, la gran novela, the greatest Catalan novel of the 19th century, Saccard in Zolá's L'Argent, or Cowperwood in Theodore Dreiser's trilogy of Desire, which is that's already in the 20th century, but is one of the great novels of the financier. However, the 4 Torquemada novels do not chronicle modern ways of quickly amassing and then or a great enormous wealth or quickly losing it, they mostly trace a slow and irresolute metamorphosis from unwholesome money lending to impeccably clean businesses, negocios limpios como el sol. El vampiro de los pobres, hecho financiero de tomo y lomo. Remarkably, though, this transition, even at its best, does not encompass or reflect a modernization of city and society, a common feature in the other novels of the financiers that I just mentioned. Rather, it constitutes a form of historical recycling with hybrid results. It yields to yet another ley del siglo por la cual la riqueza inmueble de las familias históricas, aristocrats and so on, va pasando a una segunda aristocracia cuyos pergaminos se pierden en la oscuridad de una tienda o en los repliegues de la industria usuraria. Here is the story of this unfinished business. The rich widower Torquemada loses both his revered son, a prodigy in las santísimas matemáticas, and his religious faith when his last-minute charities, his one and only unproductive investment, by the way, failed to procure from God and the Virgin his child's recovery. The child dies. And so his money was wasted in charities. Later, after a dream promises him the rebirth of his lost prodigy, yet more recycling, Torquemada, honoring friends' recommendations, makes his one far-reaching investment in luxury. He remarries into an indigent but genuinely titled family of three siblings whose perfect manners completely seduce Torquemada. The first is womanly Fidela del Águila, who becomes the compliant new wife, gives birth to a symbolically degenerate son, and then dies of consumption soon afterwards. The second is unwomanly Cruz del Águila. I'm using these terms in the way that Bernard Shaw, for example, used them. Unwomanly Cruz del Águila holds all the power. And attentive mostly to inner voices of reason and necessity, she is the skillful despot who plots with talent and good taste the aristocratic family's restauración. Restauración was a very charged word in the conservative political climate of Madrid at the time, of Spain at large. Cruz del Águila plots as well Torquemada's transformation, or metamorphosis, if you want to use Galdós' word, from shabby miser of low origins to the elegant financier Marqués de San Eloy. Finally, Rafael del Águila, alien to both labor and business, that is, alien to modern reality and its new economic hierarchies, is the neurotic aristocrat who commits suicide over his family's disreputable economic rehabilitation. The realist plot, however, is less invested in the law of the times, so the Águila's return to old splendor and Torquemada's adoption of his aristocratic demeanor, and more in Torquemada's economic resistance to both in the midst of enormous capital growth. The endless power struggle and class struggle between Cruz del Águila and Torquemada over luxury expenses is the plot's strongest driving force, and arguably a symbol of the state of the nation as well. Accordingly, the more constant focus of the plot is not the increase of capital through investments and reinvestments, which Torquemada, of course, masters from the beginning with unrivaled ease and hardly a single failure, but the accomplishment or not of the financier's productive accord of form and content. Simply put, if you're a millionaire, you have to spend some of your benefits on a luxurious life, because otherwise making so much money doesn't make any capitalist sense. If you do not invest in luxury, and teach others how to invest in luxury, make it a trend or a fashion, the system will ultimately collapse. In the novels, there is a character called Donoso, who holds the representation of the rational political economist. He educates Torquemada in bank and stock exchange operations and repeatedly enunciates the one rule that Torquemada just half obeys and half disallows. These financiers, sobriedad sórdida and apariencias de miseria, son costumbres que debemos desterrar si queremos que haya bienestar y progreso y que florezcan el comercio y la industria. Or, inadvertently quoting Adam Smith, la riqueza de las naciones. But Torquemada partakes in all essential features of the model financier, that is, infallible financial eye, exclusive dedication to business, rational disregard for individuals and details, etc., except for one. He never quite strikes that accord. No soy compatible, no caso, no ajusto. Torquemada's inadequate transition towards luxury living demotes his successful financial story to a farsa, a farce. To demonstrate the neurotic incongruities of the newly minted financier, realism seeks evidence in its usual testing grounds, which are food, dress, habitation, language, and death. And I'll come back to this in future novels. Torquemada had earlier stated very strongly, vengamos a la realidad de las cosas. Yo soy muy dado a lo real, a lo verdadero. Soy el realismo por excelencia. And what was his realism? His realism was exactly that deficiency, that lack of accord between form and content. Torquemada dies, indeed. I'm not going to go through of course, food and dress and all that stuff, not now. But death is very important here. Torquemada dies a very equivocal realist death, not only for his undecipherable last word, which is conversión. And the text, there is a question in the text, it goes, ¿es la de su alma o la de la deuda pública? Nor for the suggestion that the multimillionaire may be dying of hunger in the supreme luxury of his palace, or for the battles regarding charities in his will, but mostly for the financial intricacies of the economic power struggle. So, while Cruz del Águila completes straight trajectory and is securely settled now in proper, though somewhat antiquated, grandeur, thanks to the financier's money, the financier himself ends his journey with his squalid origins hopelessly shining through that flimsy armor of luxury and nobility imposed on him by Cruz. Besides, in a bit of a Freudian foresight, something which is very frequent in these novels, Rafael, right before his suicide, identified Torquemada's money as a muck, his monetary contributions as defecations. So you couldn't be any closer to Freud in that regard. Now, when we move from the realm of the financier to the much more populated realm of the consumer, the ordinary consumer, or from the love, and I don't want you to get me wrong, I mean, the financier was supposed to be a consumer, the ultimate consumer, the one who would pay the great fortunes for certain things that I will get to in a minute. So we move from the realm, we move to the much more populated realm of the consumer, or as Maynard Keynes put it, from the love of money as a possession to the love of money as a means to the enjoyments and realities of life, we encounter a different set of plot priorities. Woman often replaces man at the center of the plot, which doesn't mean that woman is the only consumer nor the most important one. Man is frequently a devious partner or just an obstacle in the plot's development when it comes to the novel of the consumer. Superfluous expenditures not investments, sustain the urban circulation of money, money that is hardly ever sufficient and hardly ever earned through labor. Desires distort or displace calculations. Conspicuous consumption replaces gold fever. Life replaces power. The city center is no longer the stock exchange, the bank, or the office, but shops with shop windows everywhere. Todo Madrid es un abierto bazar con el charlatanismo de sus escaparates llenos de objetos de vanidad y lujo. Surrounding that civilized center of Madrid, however, La Desheredada's cartography displays a disturbing mosaic. First, as a frame, Madrid's insane asylum, where the protagonist's father, Isidora's father, who believed himself to be the country's Minister of Finances handling huge figures, is dying a pauper's death. Then, a miserable, violent periphery where unsuccessful businesses are stranded and only infinitesimal transactions take place. At the very end, el voraginoso laberinto de las calles, a hell or an abyss that whisks away the degraded protagonist. Paris, in the meantime, looms in the distance. Paris is always present, Paris and London, but mostly Paris, they're always present in these novels for very clear, specific reasons. Paris, in the meantime, then looms in the distance as a standard of luxury values. Vete a París, aquí no las gastamos de tanto lujo como tú. That's what Dr. Mikis tells Isidora, the counterfeit aristocrat turned expensive cocotte. The complexity of La Desheredada, more so than that of the other novels that I'll be dealing with today, or most of the other novels of Galdós, for a fact, cannot be grasped from a single point of view, but every point of view should account for the economic makeup that so rigorously controls its plot. And now I'm going to go over the plot with some emphasis, of course. A conventional family romance, as Freud defined it, only here fabricated by the protagonist's own father, brings Isidora back to the city. She carries with her spurious documents that intend to prove that she is not Isidora Rufete, but Isidora de Arancis, a child born out of wedlock in an aristocratic family and entrusted to the humble Rufetes as a cover-up. Isidora believes that the time has come for the wealthy Arancis to acknowledge her as an heiress. City life, however, slowly transposes Isidora from the plot of her unrealistic family romance, and unrealistic is Galdós' word, which a family romance which will be proven a fake in court, to the realist plot of modern markets. First, from regular village worker, she turns into a city flaneuse and avid consumer. Su delicia mayor cuando la calle salía era ver escaparates, solicitada de tanto objeto bonito, rico, suntuoso. Soon, such luxuries become for her neurotic necessities. El loco amor al lujo y a las comodidades eran los puntos débiles de Isidora, su necesidad. And Dr. Mikis, his diagnosis is estado morboso, a morbid condition. Consequently, Isidora mismanages her limited funds and starts running up debts. Now, second and much more important, what I have said so far is pretty much common ground for many novels of the consumer. But here comes the important thing about La Desheredada. Throughout part one, Isidora grows into an arresting beauty. For a time, she holds the old world belief that beauty means something. It is a categorical signifier, especially when enhanced by good taste and remarkable elegance. Bastaría darle la ejecutoria being the title, the aristocratic title, bastaría darle la ejecutoria a su gran belleza, su figura, sus gustos delicados, sus simpatías por toda cosa elegante y superior. By the same token, superior beauty entitles her to all the beautiful things in the market and makes her unfit for ordinary labor. So she can't work. Just when in the Aransas and the Law's factual assessment, this interpretation is proven completamente equivocada, totally wrong, totally mistaken, Isidora quickly realizes that her beauty, like the beauty of those objects, luxury objects in shop windows, may have no meaning, but it has value, monetary value. One irony of the market is that a residue of the old belief in the meaning of beauty can contribute greatly to this beauty's monetary value. For example, what Baudrillard called genealogical value, parecía una duquesa. That's something that adds value to Isidora's body. Nadie que la viese sin saber quién era podría dudar que pertenecía a la clase más elevada de la sociedad. So Isidora, saleswoman and wears in one, as in Benjamin's famous dictum about prostitutes, sells then the luxury of her aristocratic and therefore expensive beauty in order to both pay her debts and obtain the luxurious lifestyle such beauty, helped by her never entirely shed nobility, is entitled to. Curiously, it is something that she also needs now. If she is going to continue luring rich consumers, and here are the men I was referring to before as the main consumers of the most important luxury commodity at the time. Who was the courtesan, the cocotte, whatever you want, or the prostitute, whatever you want to call her. This will become clear immediately. At that point of Isidora's serpentine reasoning, the realist narrative, the realist novelist, typically confronts the reader with the dilemma of reality principle versus pleasure principle. On the one hand, somewhat in line with period moralists like Ruskin or Withers or Rabelais, the novel is intensely critical of the luxury consumer in general and in particular of Isidora's weaknesses, her overall apreciación falsa de la realidad. On the other hand, however, the novel correlates Isidora's economics of luxury not just with the squandering of money, but also emphatically with the enjoyments of life. Las delicias del mundo. A defense of luxury that, for example, Bataille and Peter Sloterdijk will herald in the 20th and the 21st centuries. Even Dr. Mikis, who, as the voice of the reality principle, follows critically Isidora's trajectory from the start, laments at the end about his relationship with Isidora. Habiendo descubierto un tesoro, permitió que ese tesoro fuera para todos menos para él. A su lado pasó, coronada de rosas y con la copa en la mano, la imagen de la vida. And vida is here with a capital V. Isidora costs Beau, another one of his customers or consumers, Isidora costs Beau 2,000 duros, small fortune at the time. But he will admit, after coming to his financial senses, aquello es vivir. Constantly ambushed by el tormento de la realidad asquerosa, las miserias de la realidad, and remember this for the end of my argumentation, Isidora herself proclaims at one of her lowest moments, yo quiero vivir y esto no es vivir. Isidora's market logic regarding beauty would be similar to a financier's, except for one thing, her fatal flaw. She deals expertly and incessantly only in unquantifiable matters. But la realidad de las cifras eludes her. As it turns out, sociologists and most critics tiptoe, at best, around the concept of beauty, making vague references to the ties that connect beauty, luxury, and prices, and focusing on beauty in art and fashion. Thorstein Veblen, in that other extraordinary book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, comes closer to the point in a chapter called Pecuniary Canons of Taste. He considers beauty inseparable from high cost. Beauty has to be expensive. It is one of the marks of expensiveness in goods, and by habitually identifying beauty with reputability, it comes about that a beautiful article, which is not expensive, is accounted not beautiful. However, for one thing, the notion of beauty as a selling point was not restricted to the realm of the expensive luxuries. Galdós en La desheredada, for example, notes that empezaba a desarrollarse el gusto por presentar los objetos mercantiles con primor, halagando los ojos del que compra. For another, the beauty of woman or man is a rare consideration among economists and sociologists. Kopitov, for example, refers in passing to a perennial moral concern in Western thought about the commoditization of human attributes. What human attributes? Well, strength, physical abilities, etc. But he does not list beauty among those attributes. And yet, human beauty is not only overwhelmingly present in realist novels, it tends to be the main pivot of the plot. For such beauty's value, resistant to mathematical equations, depends very much on a plot where ethics, aesthetics, and economics strike dubious partnerships. La desheredada's plot, part 2, follows the sequence of incidents that degrade or elevate the value of Isidora's beauty as she moves between exclusive luxury markets and all-inclusive second-hand markets, much like her own furniture. After her romance with Joaquin, which was the first romance, Isidora's needs push her to hook up with millionaire Botín. Botín. She is at the peak of her beauty and yet not worth what she used to be when brand new. Por donde quiera que iba hacía sombra de blasones y sin embargo, por desgracia suya, empezaba a ser conocida y cuantos la encontraban sabían que no era una lady. Or laddie, supongo que dirían at the time. I guess that's the way they pronounced it at the time. Dismissed for having misallocated Botín's money, she can still turn his dismissal around. Su dinero de usted no basta a pagarme. Valgo yo infinitamente más. Now, this valgo, at least up until my mother's generation, meant something very different from what we might understand right now. When somebody of that generation said, ella no vale nada, or él no vale nada, of a couple, for example, a young couple, what they meant was exactly, she's not beautiful enough, or he's not beautiful enough, good looking enough. Yes? I suppose some of you may still remember that meaning. With Beau, she becomes more conscious of the increasing devaluation of her beauty. Ella valía infinitamente más que él, pero la dudosa ejemplaridad de su vida podía hacerla inferior. Even at the end, after Melchor's and Gaitica's episodes and her brother's execution, she seems to predicate a closure by giving up her name, or names, and family or families, while at the same time she cancels that closure by holding on to her beauty and finished trading history. Todavía soy guapa y cuando me reponga seré guapísima, valgo mucho y valdré muchísimo más. It is precisely luxury in the form of fashionable dresses, muestras de vestidos, that prompts such cancellation of the closure. As a consumer, Isidora was not fixated on dresses alone, but she did consider them irresistible charms that enthralled her and those who contemplated her wearing them. Accordingly, her long and tortuous itinerary as a beautiful luxury commodity was unfailingly punctuated by references to dresses, their contribution to Isidora's success, and the import of their deterioration. Fashionable dresses in Parisian designs are crucial pieces of the consumer games in most realist novels, or in the words of Patrizia Calefato, who's written a small but beautiful book on luxury, fashion that never goes out of fashion makes dress consumption a central cogwheel for capitalist machines. As Sombart explains, next to the silk industry, the wool industry was the most important in the early period of capitalism. So we tend to think of the Industrial Revolution as something related to metal, mostly. Well, not really. The main production in the early stages of, and later on, one of the main of the Industrial Revolution was cloth, dresses, fabrics. Veblen adds to this, no line of consumption affords a more apt illustration of pecuniary culture than expenditure on dress. Dresses, that is, as a special register of consumption, as goods whose principal use is rhetorical and social. So, not dresses as needs, because the dresses we are talking about are beyond that, are mostly a rhetorical artifact. Goods whose principal use is rhetorical and social, goods that are simply incarnated signs endowed with semiotic virtuosity. Those are Appadurai, I'm mixing here Appadurai and Baudrillard. Charles Frederick Worth, somebody you may not have heard of, was the grand couturier of European queens, courtesans, and cocottes. Maybe I should put it in a different order. The grand couturier of cocottes, courtesans, and then queens. So the first to set the fashion were the other ones. Worth was a reference de rigueur in realist novels from Wharton and Dreiser to Pardo Bazán and Galdós. Once you become aware of his name pops up everywhere in realist novels throughout the 19th century and even at the beginning of the 20th century. All those ladies purchased by the financiers go to Paris to get dressed properly by Worth. I think there is still a Worth story in Paris. So he's a real character, he's not a fictional character. Yeah, like, except that was there was no luxury in Woolworth's Lane. It was another story, and also, you know, if you are interested, in the Royal Palace in Madrid, in the archives of the Royal Palace, there are still the receipts that Worth sent Isabel II over who knows how many years. And I haven't seen them, but I have this word from the archivist of the Royal Palace. So through Worth, Paris became a colonizing power as much for exclusive and costly designs as for the parlance of fashion that pervaded the city's ordinary language, as for example, not so much in La Desheredada, but in Galdós's quintessential novel of fashion, La de Bringas. Within the realist plot, a fashionable dress generally combines representation with mediation. It mediates, or fails to mediate, the relationship between desire and the body, the woman's body as the top luxury commodity. So, the woman appears as the protagonist of the consumer's novel, the novel of the consumer, and yet what he is, in fact, or turns out to be in the end, is the object of consumption, the commodity that the men will purchase at very high prices most of the time. And Moreover, Sombart traces, and I bring this now because it's related strictly to this moment in La Desheredada, Sombart traces the root of a modern or capitalist luxury back to the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, at the point when at the point of the men's radical conversion from the sacred love of wives to the secular enjoyment of courtesans' free love. And free love, of course, doesn't mean gratis here. It means free from moral constraints, etc. So, I'm going to move now to this is about luxury, now about necessities. My last novel, and it'll be very short. The basic premise of Misericordia is a family's struggle to cope with bare necessities after falling from relative wealth into los abismos de la miseria. Curiously enough, Misericordia is a novel whose discourse has unusual economic density and specificity. Lujo, luxury, is a term that appears 46 times in La Desheredada and only 3 times in Misericordia. Luxury has, until almost the end, no visible market in Misericordia's Madrid. Miseria, on the other hand, is likely the most persistent common noun in Misericordia. It appears 40 times in the novel, but only 32 in La Desheredada, which is a text nearly twice as long as Misericordia. So the city is still a market. Many of the miserable characters, including Benina, the protagonist, it's called at some point negocianta, have some talent for commerce, aunque fuese en cosas menudas, and minuscule monetary transactions take place constantly among friends and family. However, los próceres del dinero, los que explotan la vida suntuaria, that is financiers and the like, emerge, when they emerge at all, on a different dimension. They inhabit mostly the imaginary world of stories and conversations with which the wretched ones disengage from daily reality. So it's like little novels within the novels. Inevitably, Misericordia is the realist novel of both food, the core of the necessary, in Norman Brown's words, and charity, the last resort to obtain food, or money to buy food. Hambre, by the way, hunger, appears 33 times in Misericordia and only 17 in La Desheredada. Benina, so here is more or less the plot. Benina, an intriguingly tainted evangelical figure, is an old housekeeper and mainly a cook, with an irrepressibly compassionate heart. When the middle-class family she worked for fell from economic grace to absolute indigence through economic misbehavior, she did not leave them. Moreover, she became the family's only support. In that self-imposed position, totally unorthodox from the point of view of political economy, la fiera necesidad le impuso el triste oficio mendicante, privándola en absoluto de todo otro medio de atender a los suyos. Llegó por sus pasos contados, por ley social, económica, si es que así se dice. One of the shifting and strikingly equivocal centers of Benina's Madrid is the Church of San Sebastián, where Benina goes not to pray but to mendicate, that is, sacar las perras del fondo de la masa humana. From the beggar's point of view, charity consists here almost exclusively in the direct or indirect provision of food. From the point of view of the well-to-do benefactors, exercising charity could be either a sort of luxury, as in the case of Isidora in La Desheredada, or a form of negotiation with God, as in the case of Torquemada and here in the novel Don Carlos. Except for minor adjustments, this life of charity for food continues inalterable until death. In other words, charity doesn't generate or drive a plot. On the contrary, it is by the perpetuation of a status quo at an economic rock bottom impermeable to the oscillations of capitalist markets. Aquí no hay salvación para el pobre. So, unlike the novels of financiers and consumers, Misericordia's actual fall, or rather ascent into the plot, to use Barbara Johnson's concept, occurs near the end as a cosa súbita and milagrosa. The closure and the plot start with the suerte of the unexpected arrival of ample funds that a distant cousin left in his will to his impecunious middle-class relatives. Yet another form of charity, if you think of it. Charity that plays no role in political economy, but initiates here economic normality. This is Galdós' word. Economic normality in the novel's plot. Just as suddenly, luxury expenditures reappear. The inheritor dejábase vencer de la tentación de adquirir superfluidades dispendiosas. As you can see, it's a perfect definition of luxury, which the novel will list in detail, most pertinently the menus of celebratory banquets. More than anything, this inheritance modifies power structures. Benina's empowerment was due to the absence of money and to her merciful sacrifice and her miraculous capacity for fixing multiple survival meals with a few coins. Juliana, a younger daughter-in-law, is now in charge, and her regime, called despotismo, el absolutismo puro, el régimen de terror, which is what Bernie Sanders, for example, calls Wall Street, is fed by an economist's merciless utilitarianism, el eterno predominio de la voluntad sobre el capricho y de la razón sobre la insensatez. The logical first victim of such reasoning is the old and now useless Benina, unemployable in the normalized economic plot. She's never rescued from charity's plotless reiteration, saliendo a pedir sola todos los días para ver de sacar con qué vivir. The novel could have ended at this point once the course of Normalidad Próspera began. But as in the other novels, a pathology of economic power, a neurosis, materializes here to meddle in the closure's economic reasonableness. Juliana appears to be the winner, but power has made her ill with embelecos nerviosos y ráfagas de histerismo. Benina appears to be the loser, but she understands her defeat as a glorioso triunfo. Not only sentíase victoriosa después de haber perdido la batalla en el terreno material, but also showed buenas apariencias de salud. What is more, she continues to be empowered with a type of realist reason, a sort of psychiatrist's reason. All along, Benina is not only a prodigious cook and a paragon of sanity, but a healer for the insane. In the case of her partner Almudena, lograba contenerle en la razón o traerle a la realidad y sujetarle a la vida común. The end of a chapter called End narrates a dialogue between Juliana and Benina, which is announced as breve y de mucha sustancia o miga psicológica, especially because despot Juliana acknowledges Benina's superior power. Usted sola me puede curar. And reasonably enough, this end of the end involves the last financial transaction of the plot. Juliana gives Benina 15 pesetas, with which she seems to be paying Benina's mending and closing words, typically interweaving sacred scriptures and medical textbooks, charity and market economy. Benina tells Juliana, vete a tu casa y no vuelvas a pecar. And now, one final thing, very brief, one paragraph, where I am going to turn on its head everything I have said. So in case you were not convinced, maybe you have this other option to read these novels. So my previous analysis tried to show how these realist novels, and very many others that could be adduced, engage a fundamental conflict. Martha Nussbaum sums it up neatly in a book on Dickens, when she was a partner of our colleague, the great Nobel Prize of Economics. She writes, literature expresses in its structures and its ways of speaking a sense of life that is incompatible with the vision of the world embodied in the texts of political economy, which is pretty much what I've been saying from the beginning. Recent books on this quarrel assume and often declare that novelists are generally insightful and pertinent, where economists tend to be blunt or negligent. So I would like to close my analysis by signaling to a different verdict on the subject. More than a century after the heyday of the realist novel, as prominent a philosopher as Peter Sloterdijk, although there are signs of this before. For example, Walter Benjamin, in his book on the storyteller, suggests something similar, and my friend Daniel sent me the reference the other day. So Sloterdijk declares that the real of realist novels is entirely unfounded. The realist novelist was writing for and about a society that enjoyed unprecedented wealth, as I indicated at the beginning, and for which the democratization of luxury was the true project of modernity. Such prosperous society, however, held on to a residual belief that identified the real with the tradition of the oppressed. The novelist, in that context, according to Sloterdijk, was the approved advocate of that poverty realism. All published speech is subject to the law, which demands translating the luxury in power back into the jargon of hardship. And the results are but black books on the lives of the infamous, unsupported, superfluous people. Realism then would not be a provider of credible documents or testimonies, but the established form of the belief that the disaster is always right. So no wonder our president uses the word disaster day in, day out. Sloterdijk may even be suggesting that realism's professionalized complaint, or the pretense of luck in the rich society, is but one of society's luxuries, just another form of entertainment or perverse pleasure, if you will, for the affluent leisure class. The novel, that is, as a mere commodity, another object to be acquired and devoured by the consumer. The novel as an object designed not to represent or transcribe a certain empirical reality, but to satisfy a certain empirical consumer. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Or, yeah. So I guess some
Thank
of you
you
may
very
have.
much indeed, Luis, for this
Sure.
brilliant
Absolutely.
lecture. I think we can have a few questions if anybody would like to ask any. Would you mind using
Yeah.
the microphone?
Yeah, Doris.
I wanted to offer another
Another take on this?
another Benjamin. No, just another Benjamin
Oh.
quote to accompany you because
Right.
this is a brilliant reading that you made.
Thank you.
And when Benjamin compares the storyteller with the novelist,
Yeah.
he says storytellers like to be with community.
Yes.
And a novel you read by yourself, hiding,
Right.
you know, in your own bedroom.
Right.
Novels are made to warm cold bones with other people's suffering.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's a
Right.
way of
Right. Yeah. No. There are different. There are, for example, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, one of my favorite 20th century writers. He has a book, another book, an article on tourism, and his claim is that tourists, German tourists, that is in that particular case, love to go to the poor regions of Italy spend some time there, and then go back home thinking that doesn't happen to us. We are privileged here. Let's go back to our luxurious abode, so to speak. Thank you, Doris. Yeah, Diana.
Thank you, Luis. This is wonderful, and it makes me want to read the paper and reread. You can hear me, right?
But it's
And reread Galdós. Yes. So I have a question that is sort of unclear even to myself.
Please.
And it has to do with the way you ended your essay. And what I perceive, especially in the Spanish repertoire, a real discomfort with this world of luxury and the economic development that you were referring to, which I don't see quite to that extent in the English repertoire.
Right.
Unless you look at Dickens, that's saying, oh, look at all those terrible things that are happening. But great expectations,
Right.
David Copperfield, they sort of get ahead and find their way in the world.
Right.
So can I ask you to speculate about the Spanishness of your ending?
Well, I'll begin my speculation by telling you that I was trying to avoid that speculation. But I think you are right. At the beginning, I kind of made a statement just to avoid this kind of question when I said that. Exactly. So they benefited as much as any other European country, at least on the general numbers that economists offer you today. So the economic progress during the 19th century was enormous. And yet, this can be probably, my speculation would have to start with the church. Because sumptuary laws may have been displaced. And then, but the church kept having an enormous amount of power on the society, and they were claiming
that the Catholic Church.
Yeah, in this particular case, I'm talking about the Catholic Church, and the Protestants were an entirely different story. So, on the one hand, the Catholic Church, and they still all the old. All the residues of the old conception of luxury as a sin, or as a sinful activity, overexpending in luxury items, but it remains to an extent that is probably not true in England, France, and so on and so forth. Now, the other thing is that you could say this about the whole of Spain, but to be really accurate, one would have to distinguish, because this what you're saying may be true of Madrid, may be true of Andalusia, and so on and so forth. But the Industrial Revolution took place, the bulk of the Industrial Revolution took place in only two places, Barcelona and Bilbao. And so, in those two places, the story is completely different. In the larger version of this paper, which is much larger, one of the novels I treat, the first one actually, I treat is La Febre d'Or, the Narcís Oller, and that happens in Barcelona. And that's about a real financier and how he amasses enormous wealth and then he loses it all. But in the meantime, Barcelona is growing with him and is becoming a completely modern city, and there is no such a sense of sin when you invest in great luxury objects, especially for him, who also, and I have to say that is Gillette. Gillette, when he becomes enormously wealthy, he knows that he has to invest in luxury objects. Guess what the main luxury object is going to be? A cocotte, a French cocotte, to be sure. Which creates all kinds of moral problem thing within the family and so on. But I wouldn't be able to apply this principle.
Regional specific.
Absolutely, very specific. And I don't have any novel in mind as far as Bilbao is concerned. But Bilbao, maybe some of you can remember something. Yeah.
I was thinking of later realist novels where migration plays a huge part, and I'm thinking specifically of Marcé's novels where the main male character comes from either from the south,
Yeah.
Charnego,
Yeah.
or the periphery,
Right.
and is longing to meet
The upper classes.
the
Yeah.
upper classes.
Well, that's
Not
in
the
all,
aristocrats.
practically in all of Marcé's novels. Yeah.
Exactly. So migration, and also in some novels set in Madrid, even
Right.
Barea, when he describes
Yeah.
like very
Yeah.
Baroque-like style,
Right.
how the downtrodden try to
Right.
rise. They also have to deal with commodities or luxuries
Right.
embodied women. So I think migration
Yeah.
may play a huge part in terms of how to identify
Yeah.
the relation between realism and luxury geographically. Migration plays a huge part. I
Yeah,
think.
absolutely.
I don't know
Yeah.
about the 19th century, but 20th century realist novels.
Well, that's the thing.
Introduce migration as a huge, important.
Migration was
also-
minimal in the 19th century, and then you were talking about a different period. So,
In the case of the Basque Country, the Indiano, who comes back from America,
America.
wants to marry,
right,
to have a real sense of rootedness,
Yeah.
of home.
Right.
So that's another twist to
Yes.
this intricate plot. I think
Right.
in terms of luxury, el americano hacer las Américas, I return home and I need a woman to feel rooted
Right.
again.
Yeah.
That's Baroja,
yeah,
I guess.
for example.
I'm adding too many layers.
Many,
to the
many
argument.
others too.
Yeah.
Right. No, the only your sense of the whole thing with migration is absolutely right. Now, the only problem, I finished my analysis at the end of the 19th century. I don't go any farther, and for a reason, because things change dramatically there. And in those novels, something so basic to the 19th century realist novel in its fight against the political economic theory is the distinction between necessities and luxury. When you get into the Marcé's novels, for example, that difference has vanished completely. When El Pijo Aparte goes into Teresa's car in Últimas Tardes con Teresa, he's at home. And he has also a motorcycle and all those items that have been developed throughout the 20th century, which are luxuries in principle, but they have become necessities. You can't do without a car, motorcycles, and vehicle of sorts.
Maybe value lies elsewhere in the case of Pijo.
Value lies, exactly, that's what I was going to say. Value lies elsewhere. And think of Teresa, for example, in Últimas Tardes con Teresa.
What do you make of Blasco Ibáñez, speaking of migration and a different form of economic development in the periphery, La Barraca, for instance?
Yeah.
That would lie beyond these debates?
No, it wouldn't. No, Blasco Ibáñez wouldn't, not in the early naturalist novels. Later on, it lies completely beyond all that. In the novels he wrote about World War I, Los Cuatro Jinetes del Apocalipsis and all that stuff, it is completely 20th century stuff. But in La Barraca, no, that would be a very easy object to analyze from this point of view.
As a bestseller also.
As a bestseller also. But not La Barraca. The bestseller was Los Cuatro Jinetes del Apocalipsis. Right.
Barracas was 98.
Or earlier. Yeah, I would have to check them.
But when Blasco Ibáñez was himself a commodity.
Yes.
He was,
He learned that early enough. Yeah. That he could sell himself. And but to go back to Diana's point, he was up from that point on. He became. He was totally despised by the literary establishment of the country. They wouldn't hear of him, they didn't want to have anything to do with him, and his beautiful mansions and his gold pen and his cars and all of that stuff, they found that totally despicable. But thank you. Yeah. Ricardo.
Gracias por venir.
Hombre, no faltaba más.
I'm going to reveal my ignorance with this question.
No, please. Don't say that.
Could you please illustrate us, or at least me, on the economic status or background of Pérez Galdós?
The economic status of Galdós himself?
Yeah.
The person, the writer?
The person.
Right.
Did he know what he was talking about?
Oh boy, did he? Yes. To begin with, one of the things I read in Torquemada, La riqueza de las naciones, he didn't put it there, he didn't invent it, he didn't come to him just spontaneously. La riqueza de las naciones, the wealth of nations, is one of the foundational books of capitalism, although it is from 1776, curiously enough. I don't know if it was published the 4th of July, but it could very well have been published that day. So what happened to Galdós? And we are talking about biography and how. So I don't know about his readings. It's not very clear because he had a library, but then that library kind of went to pieces. There are books on Galdós's library, but they are very insufficient, and Galdós didn't keep a large library. But about his condition. He came from the Canary Islands, the son of a relatively well-to-do family, and he arrived in Madrid. He registered for law. He tried to study law. I don't know that he ever finished. And he started writing immediately, writing plays especially. There is a new biography that just got the prize of, I wrote to you about that, didn't I? Yeah, it just got a prize, the Comillas prize. But I didn't like the biography at all. But he makes a reference to this, the Galdós's economic study. Everybody does. Everybody who's written about Galdós's life mentions his financial troubles. So he started writing for the press. He wrote innumerable articles that he was, at the beginning he wasn't, but then he was paid for them. His career as a playwright wasn't very successful at the beginning, so he abandoned that for the novel. And he started writing novels, and he had a contract with a publisher, and that he eventually realized that that contract was not very beneficial for the author, was very beneficial, for the publisher, but not for the author himself. So he created his own publishing company. Now, if Galdós did, so when you get a first edition of these books, and even that one, you, as Lynn reminded me at the beginning, you get this drawing. Galdós did it himself. This is Galdós's drawing. These and many others, some illustrations of his. For example, if you open the novelas, ¿cómo se llaman? Las 4 series de novelas históricas, ¿no? Episodios nacionales. He has a different drawing there, with a lion, and he illustrated some of the chapters. So he created this La Guirnalda y Episodios Nacionales. La Guirnalda for his regular novels and Episodios Nacionales for the other one. What happened? He started to make a lot of money then. Such a lot of money that he built for himself a fantastic little house that doesn't exist any longer because of those things that Spaniards do sometimes. But he built a beautiful chalet, a mansion really, with a garden and everything, in Santander, which was prime real estate back then and now, of course, talking about Botín. And he lived there for a while, but then he ended in poverty as well. It's not very clear how he lost all this money, but he ended up losing. What was that?
Cocottes.
Well, not exactly cocottes. Galdós had his lovers, but they were chosen in a way. He was very shy and not, very forthcoming when it came to making relationships, especially with women. But he did have a series of lovers, but they were all middle-class women, not necessarily cocottes or courtesans or anything of that kind. So he neither lost money there nor made money there. It's just that. So that's all I know about him. So he knew the struggles of an economic life, and he did want to make money, and at some point he managed to. But then eventually, at the end, there was something really sad. They realized that he was living in poverty in Madrid, and they started a collection of money in the public, a public collection of money, and starting with the king. The king, Alfonso XIII, gave, I think, 10,000 pesetas and so on and so forth. Nobody knows what happened with that money. It never got to Galdós, except in minimal amounts. So he did die in poverty in spite of all these efforts. However, when he died, it was the largest funeral. I mean, the most, the people who attended the funeral was huge. People thought of Victor Hugo's funeral, for example, and so on. So the people knew him, read him, recognized him, and loved him, but there was no money anywhere to be seen as a result of all that. I don't know if this answers your question. No, about his training, I know his training in actual economics, I'm not completely sure, but Galdós had a system to learn about things he didn't know about, which was become friends with people who knew. He did that with psychiatrists, Dr. Esquerdo, for example, with doctors. I forget the name now, but one of the most famous doctors in Madrid was his friend, and he would go there and tell him, okay, tell me about this, how a person dies with this kind of disease, what does that mean, and so on and so forth. I bet he did the same with economists, because it's reflected in the novels. I mean, there is always somebody who knows about economics and trains the character, one way or another. Okay, any more questions, or
Time to stop?
are we done? Can we go home?
So let's just give another round of
Thank you.
applause.